All right, excellent. Let's go ahead and review the poll results. Looks like, based on the individuals who responded to the poll, good 44% is not using the API at all. 31% have begun playing with it. 19% are intimate with use and using it as its primary means of connections. And 6% is still asking, what's an API? So we got just the perfect session for you today. I want to introduce you to my friend Jordan at Conveyance. Now,
Now,
Estes
Estes,
and Conveyance, we've had a long relationship together. We've worked on several shared projects. Now, at Conveyance themselves, they're a system integrator. They specialize in P21 implementation and optimization. They have a long history in P21. Bring that, with a real strong team and distribution industry expertise to their work. Now, Jordan himself, he's a business owner. He's an ERP consultant, project manager. He's currently out of sunny California. He has been with Conveyance now for more than 6 years, providing P21 services in both the functional side with logistics and supply chain, and then on the technical side with database administration, reporting, and custom solutions. And he'll be giving a session today on the P21 API. And I think this has been a topic that has been one of the more increasing areas of interest over the user community that I've found here. And so Jordan will be providing an introduction to that. And with that, Jordan, I will hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Brad, for inviting me to represent our team here today. And thank you for that generous introduction. I will begin the slideshow shortly and I share my screen and we can take it from there. All right. Share screen. Perfect. So you all should see the slideshow. Let me move some of these widgets out of the way. Excellent. All right. So as Brad mentioned, my name is Jordan Harding. I am one of the co-owners, co-founders, and a senior consultant for Conveyance Solutions. Brad covered precisely what we do and the services we offer in his introduction. So thank you again, Brad. I'd like to first talk about what I'm going to be talking about throughout this presentation, namely the P21 APIs. I'm going to first start with an introduction to APIs, broadly speaking. I'm going to attempt to not dive too deeply into the details, understanding that from our poll results, we do have a few people here who are asking the very fundamental, the very good question of what an API is. So I hope to answer that question throughout this presentation. And then I'll dive a little bit more into the P21 APIs. Notice the pluralization there. There is a misconception I will cover about the API as it's commonly referred to. Then I'll talk about a few methods that I find to work well for developing API-based solutions. And then I'll cover an example that I've selected. And after that, we can go to some Q&A. I'm sure there are plenty of questions afterwards that I hope to be able to answer. So with that, I'm going to get started with the introduction to APIs. So a lot of people, most of the people here on this call have heard the term API. Maybe they've Googled what does this acronym stand for. I put that answer here. It stands for Application Programming Interface. What that basically means can still be ambiguous. Even after a few additional Google searches, you might come away from that not really understanding exactly what this thing is, how it works, where it fits in. In a nutshell, how I would summarize it, it's really a communications protocol. It allows different clients and applications to communicate with each other. It establishes essentially the rules and the formats for how that communication is structured and how it's parsed and how functions based on that communication and operations are executed. So if you think of an API that way, you're going to be very, very close to being able to hit the road and actually start building things with it. So how exactly do these things work? So again, without getting into too many details, this interface, this communications protocol, it's something that sits on top of a web server. In P21 parlance, this will typically be your middleware server or a middleware server. Um, it interprets HTTP commands. So these are things that you can essentially send to a URL endpoint. They're appended with a get, post, put, delete operation, which summarizes fairly well how the different operations can feed into the functions of the API. And what you get back from the API is typically an XML or a JSON data package that tells you, hey, this failed or this passed, here's your order number, here's why it failed, etc. So a lot of people, of course, don't have to work with APIs day in, day out. I myself don't work with them day in, day out. It's one of the skills I've developed over time. I'm still developing it. I have tons and tons and tons to learn. And so a common question that I get asked when I begin to scope out projects and assist some of our clients in heading down the road of building API-based solutions is, if I have to hire somebody to work on this, to maintain our solutions, to build something custom, or to integrate systems, or just to facilitate integrations with some of our third-party integrators, what skills do I look for? A lot of people will put, APIs on their resume, just like a lot of people will put like Excel and Microsoft Office on their resume. And so your mileage will vary depending on just that one tag alone. So the hard skills that I would look for are familiarity with HTTP, particularly structuring requests and interpreting response headers, familiarity with data formats, particularly XML and JSON, and then anything with P21, I would recommend heavy SQL experience or SQL experience. The entire P21 application sits on top of a SQL server. And so understanding SQL and having a strong knowledge of SQL operators, how SQL commands are interpreted by servers, how they're processed, as well as just data structures in relational databases like SQL databases. That's all going to be very useful, very practical knowledge if you set out to hire someone or just to work with APIs in general. Anything after that is typically going to be a huge bonus. However, the one thing that I would say that you probably want, in addition to these API specific things or P21 specific things, is somebody who has a strong background in application development or web application development. And that will typically come with skills like Python, which is a scripting language, the C languages, particularly C#, which is commonly used in business rules for P21 as well. So there's good overlap there. And then Java and JavaScript languages like AngularJS, all of that stuff is very useful because, as we'll get into later in the presentation, the API is a tool. These API requests can really be small parts of bigger solutions. So understanding that this API skill set really has to fit into a tableau of other skills is important to understand when you're looking at, who do I need to actually build these things out. Beyond that, as with anything that is network and IT and web application related or centric, strong networking fundamentals and a strong background in network troubleshooting is going to be extremely, extremely, extremely helpful, particularly if you need to install a new API framework, if you need to help a third-party integrator get established with the API, or if you need to just really troubleshoot something that went wrong. We've had a few clients, of course, who've done upgrades to their systems, not just P21 version updates, but they've upgraded their servers or their cloud computing. and it broke a lot of things, and they didn't have anyone that could fix it. So we get a call, and we do our best to help. Thankfully, to this day, I don't think we've let any of our clients down. So hopefully, we can keep that trend going. But it just goes to show that you know, strong networking fundamentals and troubleshooting just comes in handy whenever you set out to hire someone or to take on a work stream quite like this one. So I think that's enough about the skills and APIs, generally speaking, in definitional terms and how they work. I'm going to talk now a little bit about how they look, what it looks like to have an API in your tech stack or in your system, broadly speaking. Some people are visual learners, so I put together a handy little graph at which, or infographic rather, that API sits at the center of, and I have a very, very simplified explanation for how these things function. So in this infographic, a client could be P21. It could be an e-commerce site, which I've also included here, or a custom application. It could be one of many things in a, you know, a very diverse, complex system, or a more simple one that is just the client, the API, and the database. So to simplify this as much as possible, once you have your API installed, you have that communications protocol up and running, and you've created users and you've configured access and everything like that, and you're ready to actually start sending payloads and receiving data. What this is going to look like is you're going to have your client or the application or your e-commerce site send HTTP requests to the API using that get, put, post, delete format. The API is going to parse that data. It's going to send it off where it needs to go. And then you're going to get back some data, typically in that XML or JSON format, which you can specify in your payload. So in a nutshell, this is what your system is going to look like if you build an API into it. If you take this API out, this is what most people have to this day in P21. A lot of people just haven't invested resources into developing their APIs. Like some of the people who have answered the poll today, they either don't know what it is, don't know how to use it, would like to use it, and just don't have it. And in those cases, if you take that out, then you're looking at, how do I connect my e-commerce site to P21? Do I just do some flat file SQL job solution? I'll cover that, solutions like that, kind of tangentially in later slides. Some of those solutions can still be very powerful. They can still be better than the API in some scenarios. And so we'll look at that in a little bit. But for now, I want to talk about the P21 API specifically and move on from APIs generally. So the P21 APIs, right? There's this common misconception that I've heard a lot of people talk about, particularly at the Worldwide User Group. People who are not in IT spaces, they talk about the API. And one of the most important things to understand, especially if you're a developer and you're just getting into API development, or you're just getting into developing with the P21 APIs, that it's really multiple APIs. It's actually more than just the 4 categories you see here. In fact, the entity API, the second one in this list, is actually 2 APIs. It's a REST API and a SOAP API, which is a technical distinction. It influences how you send data, how you receive data, what the capabilities of the API are. And so understanding that you really have multiple tools to work with when you get the API package, the license from Epicor, is going to influence how you conceive of solutions, how you scope your projects, and how you execute and deliver against them. So with that said, I kind of want to cover briefly what I think the purposes and best fit for each of these APIs are. I'll start with the transaction API. So you can see on this grid that bulk operations, that's something that the transaction API is purpose-built for. So if you need to send a batch of sales orders or production orders or RMAs to Profit 21 through some external endpoint or through some custom application, and you just need to create 100 of these orders all at once. Maybe let's say, for example, you have a web form on some customer-facing site, and you want to populate order data, and you want to send that to Profit 21. The transaction API is most likely going to be the best fit for this. You're going to be able to populate all of that data from your web form into specific parts of your API request. You're going to send all of that data through the API to the Profit 21 database. It's going to create all your orders. It's going to send you back those order numbers. And so you can give those then to your customers so that they can have a good number to track on. You can also pull out more data if you want after that based on whatever your needs are and the application you've built to utilize this API. But if you're going to do bulk data operations, the transaction API is going to be the best fit for that. The entity API, it does have some similar capabilities to the transaction API. However, I've found that the bulk operations are very narrowly defined. Some things just, it can't do very well. I've ran into error after error after error trying to get it to do bulk operations, and I found just the transaction API is so much better at it. If you do have to pass a single transaction, it can do quite well. Truth be told, I tend to use the entity API least or second least among these four, with interactive API probably being the least used one here, and I'll talk about that and why that is in a little bit. Next, I will skip the interactive API and talk about the data services API, sometimes called the OData API. In this context, OData stands for Open Data Protocol. It's a very common structure for amongst APIs, and the common use, the best fit for the data services API is really just to get data out of your database without having to have someone in SQL Server Management Studio querying the database with SQL or pulling a report directly out of Profit 21. If you need to send data to a third party routinely, or if you just need to give a third party access to a specific set of data, you can use the data services API to define what data they need to they can access, and you can also give them the ability to just query your database views, not the tables, the views, and get any data they need out that way. So this can be really, really useful. If you have an e-commerce integration, you need to pull out price data, you need to pull out item data, you can use the data services API. It's very quick, it's very responsive, it's very useful really for getting this data out and just populating the information on your e-commerce website if that's what you're trying to do. So last but not least, on this slide, I'm going to talk about the interactive API. So if you look at the description for this API, particularly if you've already bought the API license from Epicor, they say it's a revolutionary tool and it does this and that and the other thing. Really, what the interactive API is it's a way to replicate a user actually sitting in front of the Profit 21 user interface and going through whatever process that you're trying to execute. So if we stick with order entry, for example, this interactive stateful headless Profit 21 session, it uses the API user token to essentially go through the order entry process, more or less click by click, field by field, and interacting with any pop-ups that come along the way, which is a big use case for the interactive API. You're basically going to have to tell it, this is the data I want to send. And then since it's a stateful API, which means it can send requests back to you for more data, and you can send more data back, and you can go back and forth and give it what it needs throughout this this step-by-step process. If you have for example, a business rule that triggers when you have a will call order check, so the will call flag on the order entry screen. I think that's in the front counter tab. Might be wrong about that. If you have that checked and you have a pop-up because of your business rule and it says, hey, this is a will call order. We only do this for a certain amount of customers or a certain selection of customers. Please make sure that your customer is one of these ones before you continue and save the order. And then you have to hit OK to clear this pop-up. If you try to create a transaction with the entity API or the transaction API and you have this business rule active, it's very possible that you get an error and it tells you that it was expecting input that it didn't get, and you can bang your head against the wall trying to figure out what the heck did I not pass to the API that I needed to pass to get my data into P21. Realistically, because the error handling, the nature of the error handling, and particularly the lack of information that typically comes back at these errors, you won't know that, oh, there's this business rule. One of the ways to get around is just using the interactive API. You will get a request back that says, I need an OK, and then you just pass the OK to it, and it lets you continue through the process. And the next step might just be, OK, I saved it, and now it's in the database. If you need to do something more complicated, and if you can conceive of a process that a user would sit down and they would go step by step, and they would go from this screen to that screen and then back to this screen, and then, or tab to tab within a screen, or they add a line and then make an alert, or, you know, whatever you can think of. Honestly, the interactive API can do it. It is, I'm going to be perfectly frank, it can be a huge headache to develop for. There is a lot of time that can go into a scope or a project that involves heavy development for the interactive API. So that in a nutshell is the APIs that are, I guess, the most primarily used among the P21 APIs. It looks like 4, it's probably more like 6 or 7, depending on who's counting. There's a services API for administration. There's a few other APIs, I think. I would have to look at the documentation to be perfectly sure. But in a nutshell, I think the big concept I wanted to convey in this slide is that you really have to pick the right one for the scope that you're developing toward. And that can be a little bit of a chore sometimes. But among the suite of P21 APIs, you typically have what you need. And that actually leads into the next slide I wanted to discuss. So just generally the pros and cons of the P21 APIs. I'm going to start with the pros because I find it's better just to start with the positive things. It cushions a little bit of the negative aspects of the APIs I want to discuss. So right off the bat, I think what I ended with on the last slide, anything you can do in the P21 UI, you can do with the APIs, be it the transaction entity, or if you must, the interactive API. It allows you to connect multiple systems, automate some processes. I think that's probably why a lot of people might be interested in the P21 APIs. It can do this. I have built plenty of automated processes. I've helped third-party integrators integrate with it. It is possible. Some of you might have tried to take on some of these projects and had some success, maybe not. It's all very par for the course for the P21 APIs, but I would say just know that it is possible that you can do it. It just might take a little bit of iteration, some figuring some things out, and it might take a little longer than you think it did at the start. That's pretty common. Another best use case, I think, is it does make that data safely accessible to third parties. So if you do have a vendor that needs some data out of your database, and you want to give them access to the API, you can create an API consumer for them with a consumer token, and you can control their access from the API management screen. If for whatever reason you need to terminate the relationship, or maybe their company goes out of business or no longer offers that service anymore, it's very, very easy and nearly foolproof to just go in, deauthenticate their user, They're no longer a consumer of your API, and they won't be able to get any more data out if they try to send the same request they used to send. And they won't be able to get an authentication token after that. So it's really, in my mind, a really good way to manage third-party access to your database. And that's an important pro to keep in mind. Okay. I'll talk about the cons a little bit. The last thing I want to say is there's definitely more pros. There's definitely a lot more cons as well. These are just the ones that I selected for this presentation, the ones I thought were germane to the stage. So if later on we have some questions about, what else can we do with it? What else is good about it? What else is bad about it? Hopefully I can answer some of those. So onto the cons then. So one of the most consistent complaints that we hear or requests for improvement from Epicor is the documentation for the P21 APIs. Unlike a lot of more commonly used APIs, like maybe the Google APIs and the Amazon Web Service APIs, even the Stripe APIs for point of sale payment, the documentation for those is excellent. You know exactly what you're getting into before you spend a penny. You could probably develop for it before you even have access to it. With P21, the P21 APIs, it's gated behind the sale of that license. So you have to buy it to have access to the documentation to know how to start developing for it. There are ways around that, of course. I'm sure you could find someone on the worldwide user group who has extracted some of the documentation or who will let you see it on a screen share or something like that. But typically speaking, you have to buy it to get access to it. And then when you do get access to it, the common complaint is that it's not thorough, it's not comprehensive. It does provide some examples, but if you're trying to do anything more complicated than the most basic things, you're gonna have to figure a lot of it out. Which kind of goes to the next 2 points. So figuring out which API is the best fit for what you're trying to do, that can take some testing. Like I was saying earlier, you could have a very good idea of what you want to do. You could have a very good idea of what you need for a third-party integrator or service, and what you need to get into the database. And so let's say you set out to use the transaction API and you find out it doesn't work because you have that business rule, or you have run into some other wall or limitation that you can't get around the transaction API. In a project that we actually very recently undertook, we thought it was going to be, a simple, quick turnaround thing. And then we found out, oh, it's actually a little more complicated than that. There's some issues with adding notes to this order. We had to go back to our client. We had to reevaluate, what we're going to actually do to deliver the solution they need. And we ended up taking a different direction. So that I think is fairly normal, but obviously painful in its own way. To all of these points that I've discussed, and as I mentioned on the slide, it requires a lot more iterative testing and work than some of those other APIs I mentioned that people might have some experience with. If you want to use the Google Places API to validate some address details, you could probably put something together if you're pretty experienced in, an hour or two, and it works just fine. If you wanted to do something similar with the P21 API, first, I don't think it has the address validation capability, but let's say that it did, it would still probably take you, orders of magnitude longer, because you just have to figure out where this is, what the definition is. You have to reduce that definition to only the things that you want to send. It could be quite laborious. So that's something that I've heard a lot of people who have tried and who have successfully executed projects like with the API. They tend to say all this, have the same complaints, and there's some of the things that I outlined in this slide. So with that being said, you might ask, what works best? I just want to know what works. Just tell me how to do it well. I'm probably not the absolute best person you can ask about that. We have some people on our team that I would personally task with giving you those answers. And I don't typically include a whole lot of quotes from notable figures on my presentations, but I think this one from Mark Twain pretty much sums up my personal approach and what I find works best for the P21 API. It's, you know, whatever looks like looks the least like work. It's going to. I find it's a lot easier to build something that maybe doesn't work 100%, find out what's broken about it, fix it, and then determine if that fits best. I might try a couple other things to see if there's a better fit. But typically with the P21 APIs, just for the sake of not blowing a scope out of the water by working, you know, two times as many hours as we quoted, this tends to be the fastest and best process I've found. So some tools I use and tools I'll recommend. I would recommend anyone who starts to develop for the P21 APIs or APIs generally to use Postman. There are other platforms, other development environments like Insomnia and Swagger, and I'm sure dozens of others if you Google it. I tend to like the feature set in Postman. I find it's very easy to learn. It's free, which is excellent. And it allows you to collaborate well with a team, which I really appreciate. Once you have your development environment of choice, or maybe you already have one, maybe you've already done the second thing as well. The most important thing you can do to be a successful API developer, in my mind, is to build a collection of requests for the APIs that you're working with. So in the case of the P21 API, you're going to want to build a collection for the entity API, for the transaction API, even requests for the interactive API. There are similarities, of course, between them all, but just having the very specific, you know, bare minimum requirements of this is what I need to get an order through the system by the API, it's going to really cut down on your development times, because you'll find out pretty quickly that, especially if you're a consultant helping, you know, a diversity of clients with their own diversity of needs, that you're going to run into very similar requests that require the same API calls or posts or resource, essentially. And just having that in your collection and being able to pull it off the shelf, just like with any development effort, like business rules, it is going to be a feather in your cap. It's going to work in your favor. So the two categories I would really suggest that people do this on first would be the transaction API, building templates for those, so sales orders, purchase orders, RMAs, all that stuff. And then OData calls for the data services API. And this will be commonly used views like the OE header, OE line view, PO header, PO line. All of those ones are going to be very common. And so I would advise just having those on hand. Some of you who have already gone looking for help, particularly on the Worldwide User Group Forum, might have found Philippe Maurer or Mike Moriasoli, both of which I would recommend getting in touch with if you have any questions, in addition to us, of course. But those two guys in particular, as well as some other people who are particularly active on the Worldwide User Group Forum for the P21 APIs, they are a wealth of knowledge. Their experience goes back long, you know, prior to when mine started. They can talk to you about the most deep in the weeds, most detailed issues and approaches that you could possibly think of. If you want to talk to Mike about NUMA node alignment in the old Prophet 21 application and SQL thread performance optimization and load balancing and middleware servers, those guys are very excellent. They typically host the Worldwide User Group API roundtables. Excellent resources to have. Philippe in particular, and this is why I included this on this slide, has made publicly available a small collection of API resources for Postman that you can go on the Worldwide User Group Forum, you can download, and you can just start using. He's been very proactive in, pardon me, he's been very proactive in putting notes and comments into his code, which is, if anyone here is a developer and they've had to learn a new language and you've had to work from examples, you know, sometimes they don't always have good notes, they don't have good comments. Maybe some people on your developing teams are the people you harp on. Please put comments in your code. I need to know what this does. I can't just spend time figuring it out. So Fleep has done that, and it's a very good starting point for people who are looking to build the skill set up. The last point I want to talk about here is really just a mindset that I find helps a lot. It's what I kind of led out with for this slide. It's the build it, test it, break it, fix it mindset. It's not always the most optimal, most efficient. Sometimes you know exactly what you need to do. But if you don't, and you're in a process of discovery, you can't be discouraged by initial failure and running into errors, and you can't stick with the same approach and just bang your head against the wall. You have to be willing to try new things. You have to be willing to take a success and also go back and revisit it and see how you can make it better. See if a different approach might actually be a better one. Along with that, testing those different APIs and understanding that last point that what works isn't always what's best. Those are all things that are going to come in handy for anyone who sets out to develop not just APIs, but a whole suite of other things as well in the programming IT space. So that's what I find works for me. Members on my team have slightly different approaches, of course. I think generally, almost from a philosophical standpoint, a lot of this stuff is applicable. And so I'd like to move on to an example I've selected. And I've reduced this, as with some other subjects I've already covered, into the basics. I find it's really helpful to just start here, start at this is what this looks like. This is what you can do, and then to build from there. So what I've done here is I've taken a example of an RMA order creation, so an RMA creation post through the transaction API. I've collapsed all the data elements, and that's what you see at that top screenshot. I've included comments here that say this is why this is required. All of the data elements in this post are required, at least for this environment. They will be commonly required in most of your environments as well. And then I've also expanded the top one, which is, if you're familiar with the P21 user interface, particularly RMA entry, if you open RMA entry, that first tab that you see at the header level that has your RMA number, that has your sales location, that has the customer, all that stuff. This is the data element for that I've blown up here, and it has the bare minimum requirements filled out here for what you would need to pass through the transaction API to get your order to go through, to get your RMA created. And so there are some things here, and I'm sure if you if you have the P21 API and you search up a transaction definition in the REST Services Explorer, or whatever it's called on the middleware server, you'll find that there's a lot of, in the definition, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fields. Like these things could be several thousand lines of data. This entire post, I think, is about 180 or so lines. So if you think about the context of that 2,000, 3,000 lines of data, and all you really need is those 180, you can see very quickly how just building up these templates and having them on hand of, hey, this is all I need and I can build off of that. That is super useful because building those things can take a lot of time. It can take hours sometimes. And so just having them so you can start there is going to be a lot better. So I really just wanted to show an example of why I take that approach, why I think it works really well. I wanted to show exactly what these things look like and what the data looks like when you pass it through your post body to your API endpoint and then get a request back. What I would really like to do, Brad, and you and I didn't really have an opportunity because of our schedules and the timeliness of the event to really be able to coordinate. I'd like to be able to provide the 2 files that I have, really just pictures of here in the deck, which is this example of this API post and then the response you get back with the order number. I'd like to make that available to people upon request. So if we could work that out, I would be, I'd be thrilled. I think it'd be very helpful.
Yes, definitely. I think that would be a great idea.
Awesome. Excellent. And regrettably, I was thinking about how, what's the best way to show a bunch of people outside our organization that aren't our clients, like I can't show them some of the clients based solutions I've made. I can't show them some of our proprietary stuff. So this was a brief and good way, I think, to show this information. Obviously, it's not as detailed as you would need to just take it and run with it, I think, and be very, very successful and do anything you want with the APIs. It's a very deep subject. I was thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about it. I would like to talk about it a little bit more. So I'm going to move on now to the Q&A. I know I'm a little ahead of time, Brad, but I think it's going to serve pretty well to have some extra time for questions for the subject.
No, I think that makes good sense here. Got a question that came through. Question is, how do you expose the API safely?
Yeah, so the API, you can configure a consumer, so it is just like an authorized user in your network. You are able to give a authentication token to that user, and then using the API management page, you're able to say these are the permissions for this user, and you can deauth them at any point and remove their access really with the click of a button. So it makes it really, really, really easy to manage access, which is one of the key pillars of managing your security. Other than that, you can also expose that user just to have permissions for certain tables in your database.
Gotcha. What have you seen most often? Have you seen API connection going through the firewall or at a higher level of aggregation like a Azure interface layer?
Yeah, so typically it goes through the firewall, I believe. You target a specific port on the endpoint that has to be exposed to your API client, the client that's sending the requests. So I believe it does go through the firewall.
Gotcha. And what have you seen so far in terms of performance? I know I'm not sure if necessarily with P21 specifically, but we've seen some other systems where the user base complains about the performance in terms of transactions per minute that can be processed with an
Yeah.
API. I'm assuming it's on account of the number of layers that it's working through to get to actual business logic layers. What have you found there in terms of the performance? And have you found any tricks in terms of making performance better using the API?
That's a fantastic question. Um, I think it's really one of those meat and potatoes questions that a lot of people have about the API. So let me see if I can break this into parts. I think performance is an issue with the P21 APIs, a big issue. From what I understand, Epicor is aware of this. They've hired a team to improve the performance, to retool some of the API architecture, and to kind of alleviate this issue. I know historically this was largely due to single threading performance on writes to the P21 database. I am not sure if this is something that's been alleviated by the advent of the P21 web UI. I wouldn't think so. But I know that historically, if you tried to write back a large mass of data transactions to the database, you're dealing with a single thread. And so to alleviate that problem, some of the people I mentioned, Mike and Philippe, they've tried a lot of things. They were going to pneumonode alignment and really aligning all the cores on their hypervisor to make sure that they were getting the best performance they could. I think one of the things that anyone can do is really have two middleware servers. If you're on the web, have one for user access, and then have one just for the API, and then make sure that middleware server for the API is optimized for single thread performance. So that would be fewer cores on that server with higher single thread processing metrics.
Oh, nice. That's an interesting configuration for that. I'd
Mhm.
never thought about that. That makes a lot of sense. I got another question come in. Does the API have any checks to ensure that you're not loading bad data?
Uh, yes and no. All right, so it depends which API you're talking about. Again, the entity API has strong data typing, which means that you can't pass anything through it that wouldn't otherwise go into those fields. Moreover, the transaction API as well will kick back errors if you feed it bad data. So for example, on that example we looked at of the, and I can go back here, I think, if I'm still sharing. If we looked at the sales location ID here on this blown up example of this data element, if I passed in an extra 0, or if I passed in no data at all, I would get an error saying, hey, you need a valid location ID. Just like you would if you tried to actually save a transaction in the UI. You would get an error calling out that field specifically.
Gotcha. So if you were if you were integrating with the sales order
Mhm.
service and loading part numbers that didn't exist in the part master, is there referential checks to make sure that you're not loading bogus part numbers, or does it care?
I believe so, yeah. If you don't pass a valid item ID, and this is to say, you could pass the wrong item ID, but if it's a valid item ID, it'll still pass.
Mhm.
But if you just pass in blank data or just gobbledygook, you should get an error saying you need a valid item ID.
Excellent. We are still taking questions here. If you have any more, one question I had: when you're writing custom programs
Mhm.
to interact, do you find a best practice that your team has discerned in terms of where to store or locate those finished projects? I don't know if we're working at a DLL level or whatever the program kind of compiled format is. Do you find a best case of where to stick that information for things like performance or interoperability, what have you?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, Brad. I don't think there is a single best practice, and the reason I say that is because there's a tremendous amount of variation in the programs that you do end up building. It could be anything from, a third-party program which doesn't even touch your network, and it's all of the API resources are just given to this third party. They integrate it in their system, and then they send the payloads and receive the data. Other applications like something that would be DLL based, like a business rule, I would say would fit right in with the rest of the business rules DLLs. And then if you
Mm.
build a custom application, which I think was the source of your question, typically our clients have a good file structure and they want to have these resources placed in a specific area of their network. And there are just some ABC type requirements for where this should be. I think it should be a network discoverable drive that is not that is exposed to the user that needs to access it. So if it's a business rule, the business rule user needs to have credentials to access your network discoverable drive and the folder location inside of it. I think that's a really good way to manage these resources, and it keeps them clearly visible, and it makes sure that anyone who needs to go tweak something, further develop it, or identify where an issue is, if one comes up, they can find it.
Excellent. Okay, well, I don't see any more questions coming through the feed here, Jordan. So I think we'll call it a day here. Thank you so much for the session. This is a great session, digging deeper into the API structure that P21 offers. Really appreciate the time you put in.
My pleasure. Thanks again for the invite. Have a good one,
Very
Brett.
good.